It's December 11th, 2001. This is Tuesday Night Talks. The subject is going to be Maya. Hi, everybody. Hi. So last time we were talking about Leela, and this time we'll talk about Maya, which is the same thing as Leela, just that the way of looking at it's different. Maya is the word that the Eastern religions use, the Hindu and Buddhist religions. Joel Goldsmith talks about Maya a lot. He calls it hypnotism. Exactly the same thing. We'll spend a few minutes talking and see if we can't get to where we can get a clear picture of what that means. As usual, I'm not asking you to believe in the reality of Maya. What I'm asking you to do is see if you can understand what I'm saying, and then you go out there and discover whether or not it's true for you. Usually, Robert starts talking about Maya. He talks. His translation of the word Maya is the grand illusion, and he says it's like the classic Indian story. They always talk about the illusion of the snake and the rope. It's dark in the evening, and in India there's lots of cobras. Cobras are very deadly, and people have been known to go out at night to go back to the outdoor plumbing or whatever and step on a rope. And their mind, they look down and see the shape, and their mind tells them it's a snake. And people have died of a heart attack from stepping on a rope. And of course, if you ever get a chance to just really see that it's a rope, then all the fear is gone. And having seen that it's a rope, that rope will never fool you again. But when you first glanced at it, you saw a snake. And of course, the body reacted to that as if it were real. Another example that they use a lot is about mirages in the desert, where you see water out there. And that's a really good one that I like to use because it gives you a good sense of the reality. I mean, you see water. In the case of the snake and the rope, once you know it's a rope, you don't see snake anymore, you only see rope. But when you're in the desert, you look out there and you see water, and you know it's a mirage if you've been around a bit. But you continue to see water. And the most common one that we all encounter is on the road. You come over a hill in the desert and look down, and there's this river where the road is. And this is an example that Joel uses too as far as hypnotism. If you come over the hill and you look down and you see the river, which is just the reflection, the light reflected. It's really the sun reflecting the sky reflecting off the road. But since we know that roads don't reflect, our mind says, well, that's got to be water. That's the only thing it could possibly allow us to look down and see the sky. But if we didn't know what that was and we came over the hill, we'd say, uh-oh, there's a river. No way I'm going to get across the desert on this, and you'd park your car and, call AAA and try to find alternate routes and try to figure out what to do about the water down there because there's no way you're going to get through that water to get where you're going. So if you bought the belief, you'd be stranded. Alternatively, if you trust somebody who says, well, it's really just the road and it's just the way the light is, and you start driving down there, as you approach, the water moves back, and eventually you get through, and there certainly was no water. Nonetheless, your mind will tell you the next time you come over that hill in the same conditions, there's a river. So we see things that aren't true, and we either let them determine our life or not. And it's an indication of the power we have in the choices we make, where we clearly see the water and yet we know it's just an illusion, just a mirage. Now Joel's point is that specifically disease, he uses the example when he's talking about diseases or lack or things like this, error, he calls it. When you see disease, once again, you're dealing with the hypnotism. Your mind believes in disease, and therefore you accept it. And if you believe it, then so it is unto you, and it will stop you. The interesting thing about that water on the road is that as you drive down the road never was wet. If you get out of your car and feel it, it's not like the water moved back as you approached. The road never was wet. Yeah, it looks like it should have been, but it never was. Similarly, even though your body has the appearance of being sick, that which you really are, the one who's been hypnotized into believing he or she has a body that's sick, that one is untouched by the hypnosis, by the lie, by the false belief. It's important to keep clear that all of these false beliefs and all of this hypnotism and all of these lies don't have any effect on reality. The sand was never wet, the road was never wet, the rope was never a snake. Joel's other example is in fact the case of hypnotism. He explains why he uses hypnotism. People can be hypnotized. His classic case is always to see a white poodle. You can hypnotize somebody to see a white poodle and tell them that they're going to be followed by a good hypnotist can hypnotize you and tell you you're going to be followed by a white poodle, and you will wander around and you'll look back and you'll see that white poodle. There's no question about it. It'll look exactly like you think a white poodle should look, and you get to construct the white poodle. He just said white poodle, but you'll construct a little white poodle, and you'll construct a large one or a toy or whatever your mind says for white poodle. And that white poodle will follow you, and you'll wander around making room for the white poodle and holding the door for it and doing all this stuff, and of course nobody else sees the white poodle, but this is the nature of hypnotism. You go to somebody and you'll say, help me get rid of this white poodle. And that's not the right question. The question is, help me wake up so I don't see this white poodle. Nobody can help you not see the white poodle. Nobody can help you get rid of the white poodle. It's not there. So, similarly, help me get rid of this disease is not the right point. Because the disease is not there, the right point is help me wake up so that I don't see this disease. And Robert tells one more story. When he was 10, I guess it was, he went with his uncle to see a hypnotist in New York City somewhere. And his uncle was invited to go up on the stage as one of the potential people to be hypnotized. I guess they called up 25 people, and then the hypnotist interviewed them and selected 5 of them and hypnotized them. And his uncle was one of the 5. And when the act was over, the hypnotist told his uncle, he said, okay, now I'm going to wake you 5 up. And he said to his uncle, he said, now, but when I clap my hands later, you're going to get bit on the neck by a black widow spider. And so then he clapped his hands, and they woke up and they went back to their seats. And his uncle, Robert's uncle, was saying to Robert that he didn't think he was probably hypnotized at all. And about that time, the guy up on the stage clapped his hand, and his uncle jumped up and was brushing his neck, and trying to get this spider. And he said, help me, Robert, there's a spider on my neck. And, Robert's laughing his ass off, of course. It's just very hilarious. And then the guy clapped his hands again, and he woke up from that illusion too. But Robert then looked at his neck, and on his neck was a red welt, a spider bite, where the spider had bit him, the spider that wasn't there. had bit him. And the mark was there. And that's just a demonstration of the power of your mind. It certainly can produce marks. It can produce, superhuman strength under incredible stress. If you can hypnotize people to do things that have much greater strength than they can bring to mind, I mean, your body is certainly capable of manifesting what it believes is the point of this. Robert's point about bite on the neck is he uses that story in answer to the question, well, where did all this stuff come from? The answer is it came from the same place that bite on his uncle's neck came from. Your mind, or nowhere. So that's sort of what we're talking about. My favorite way of looking, I like to find ways of looking at this stuff so that I can see it and remember the points about it. I try to understand what Robert's seeing, because the difference between Robert and the rest of us is that Robert always knows it's Maya, whereas we're almost always sucked in and believing that it's real. The next example is when you go to a movie and you're in the movie theater and you're sitting in a seat with Coke in your hand and you're watching a movie. There's a big screen up there that is probably 30 feet high and 50 feet wide, or however big movie screens are. And there may be a horror movie going on, there may be a war going on, people getting their heads cut off, and your body gets all upset about that. Or if it's a scary movie where somebody's going to get their head cut off, and your adrenaline starts going and your emotions start going and your stomach tightens up, and you get all worried about it. And the reality is that you're sitting there very worried and concerned, and your heart's pounding and your pulse is very high and you're breaking out in a sweat and everything, and what you're doing is you're sitting in a chair in a movie theater looking at colored lights on a screen. It's a static screen and just different, colored lights flickering on a screen. That's what you're looking at. And yet your heart's racing and you're scared for the people and your pulse is pounding and you're breaking out in a sweat and there's tears running out of your eyes and all this great concern. I mean, you bought the story, and it's just colored lights on the screen. If somebody in the back of the theater had a flashlight or some sort of a light that wasn't real bright, it was just sort of bright, and shined it up there, like a spotlight on the screen, then you would see the screen behind the colored lights. You'd still see the colored lights flickering on it, but if somebody opened a door or something, or the light wasn't dark enough in there, then you could see the screen as well as the colored lights. And that's sort of what it means to be always, then you'd be always aware that it was a movie, and you would not be nearly as upset or uptight or emotional about it, because you'd be sitting there thinking, well, I see this horror story going on, but I see that it's a movie. I always see that it's a movie because of the light behind the screen, or the light shining on the screen that allows you to stay aware of the screen. But usually what happens when we go to a movie is we forget that the screen exists. And all we see is the lights. And they sell us. If they add, of course, Dolby sound to suck in your second sense, and I'm sure if they could figure out a way to control it, they'd waft perfumes and the smell of blood and things like that through the theater to suck in your third sense. And when they take you on the tours through Universal Studios and such like, they throw in the vibrations to throw in the fourth sense. If they could get all five of your senses involved, then you'd have no way of knowing that it wasn't real. You'd be completely sucked in. It turns out that your eyes are your primary sense and your ears are secondary, so if they get your eyes and ears sold, you forget about the rest of the stuff. I mean, the fact that your butt's on a chair doesn't have anything to do with it, or your arm's on an armrest. You forget about those, and you're just pulled into the movie, the belief in the reality of the movie. And of course, usually you associate with somebody, you're worried about so-and-so, so you're associated with a particular actor or actress or a particular role up there.
Maybe you just really want to get your $8 worth. Must have something to do with the fact that we want a person to take.
No. You want to because you get sucked in.
Oh, okay.
You don't get sucked in because you want to get your $8 worth. It's worth $8 to you because you get sucked in and you get to forget that it's you.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You don't think it's a form of escapism?
Of course it's a form of escapism. Now in the screen in the movie, one thing to notice is that, up comes a love scene, and then up comes a horror scene, and heads getting chopped off, and up comes this kind of scene, and that kind of scene. And, of course, the screen, which is the reality of all this, what's really happening is the screen, and the screen is unchanged by it. The screen is not touched by it at all, okay? And that's an important point to notice about the screen in the movie, that no matter what kind of movie you show on the screen, and what kind of sound you play through the speakers, the screen doesn't change and the speakers don't change. All that changes is what's in your head. Now, in this comparison of this to Maya, we have to change the picture just slightly, because right now we have a screen and movies on it and you sitting out here watching the movie. And in the comparison of Maya, the screen corresponds to consciousness and the movie corresponds to this human experience. And so there's not somebody watching the Maya. The fact is that you need to think of the screen. Like, imagine the movie as if you were the screen. So you're the screen and all this stuff is going on you, okay? Think of it that way, that this is that you're the screen. The screen is the consciousness, and all this horror or love or cartoons or whatever it is that's being shown are being shown on you, and also you're the projector. So of course the analogy doesn't match across, but if you think about that, think about if you were the screen and you were the projector, and then the problem is that you would be, then if you got sucked into the movie, the problem would be that you were forgetting that you were the screen and that you were projecting it. You would start believing your own images, in other words. Do you see what I'm saying? I want to get rid of this person sitting out in the audience, because there's only two players. There's only the screen and the movie that's happening here. And the screen is consciousness. The consciousness is the projector and the substance of the thing upon which the movie is being projected. And what we call Maya is the movie that's going on. And if the screen is looking, this is, wow, look at all these colored lights flickering across me, then the screen is an enlightened screen. And if the screen says, oh my God, it's Frankenstein, I hope he doesn't tear me, or, I hope that guy swinging the axe doesn't cut me, or something like that, then he's in the illusion, he's in the hypnotism, he's in the Maya. So the claim about Maya is something that you've heard here 100 times, if you've been here 100 times. All there is consciousness. All there is the one consciousness. And that would be the screen. It would appear to be a three-dimensional, let's think of it in terms of a three-dimensional screen, or actually a four-dimensional screen. 3 dimensions in space and 1 dimension in time. So it's really a 4-dimensional screen, but consciousness is the 4-dimensional screen, and all the things that we think of as this world, as the 3D world, as the material world, as, that'll sound good on the tape, as hard physical things, is really just images in consciousness. Sort of like a hologram, like a holograph in consciousness. And the thing that sucks us in so completely is that we go to movies and we get sucked in completely on 2 senses. Well, in the Maya, all 5 senses work. The thing that's absolutely convincing is that, we see what we see and we pretty much trust it, and we hear what we hear and we pretty much trust it, but when we can put our hand on it, that's our yardstick for knowing the reality of it, Yep, this is real. So the fact that the illusion involves all 5 senses is what makes it so very compelling and very convincing. Of course, you should keep in mind that the 5 senses that you have that are compelling you are part of the Maya. The reality is just the consciousness. So the fact that you're believing so convincingly your 5 senses is part of the story on the screen. Oh, this picture is a body with 5 senses, and these 5 senses are seeing this, but it's all part of the Maya. The body that has the 5 senses is part of the Maya. The perception of the 5 senses is part of the Maya. It's all part of the Maya. The Maya, all of this that we're seeing is happening in mind. And it's happening in your mind, and it's happening in my mind, but it's really happening in the mind. Mind is an aspect of consciousness, of the consciousness. The mind is an aspect of the consciousness. And the entire universe is within mind. I would make the case that everything that you're conscious of must be within consciousness. If it's not within consciousness, you're not conscious of it. So it's clearly everything in the entire universe is within consciousness. Now that for years sounded to me like a sleight of hand, like a quick story. But I'll take 2 or 3 approaches. The first approach is that let's start. First of all, the fact that it feels so real physically is what convinces me that it's real. And we can pretty clearly make a case using no mystical concepts at all, using nothing but physics, that's a nonsense. Because if you consider the nature of matter, all matter is made up of atoms. And the atoms are really far apart. There's really a lot of space between the atoms. I mean, like lots of space, like space between solar systems in the big space. And so it's way 99.999 something or other % vacuum. matter is. So you look at that, let's say 0.1%, that is the actual atom. And the atom is really a nucleus with electrons flying around it. And again, the distances here, the proportional distances, are a lot like planets flying around the sun. I mean, the electrons are really far from the nucleus of the atom compared to their relative size. So even that fraction of 1% that we say is matter, that, well, the atoms matter, it's 99.9999% vacuum. And then when you get down to these little electrons that really are the particles that are real, if you look at any kind of physics today, they'll tell you that they're not particles, they're waves. Or if you really get into studying some of the New Age physics, wave mechanics, they're probabilities. It's not that this electron is here, there's this probability that whatever we're calling an electron is here or there or somewhere. And if you really look at the wave mechanics equations, you say, well, how do you know where an electron is? When you look at it, when you actually measure it, if you pin down, it's almost impossible, the uncertainty principle, to measure it moves it. If you want to know where it is, you can't know how fast it's going, and if you want to know how fast it's going, you can't know where it is. But to measure it is the only way that the probability equations get a solution. Like you wonder, where is this thing? It's probably within this ball, And if somebody will actually measure it, and see where it is, then you know where it is, but now it's no longer the electron, and it no longer has the properties that it had before because you've measured it. Doesn't matter about that. What's interesting is that in order to give the electron anything that we might come close to calling it reality, a human being had to look at it. Okay? It had to be seen in your mind. So this tiny little fraction of what's real, of the total reality, the rest of it we already agree is just pure space and vacuum. This tiny little reality isn't even there until we look at it. So I again claim it's all in your mind. Mostly it's vacuum. Mostly it's nothing. Vacuum is not even a word because vacuum sounds like something. Mostly it's nothing. And the little part that isn't nothing isn't really anything unless you look at it, which is to say it's in your mind. The human beings have to be involved or nothing has any location and position. So physics certainly agrees that there's nothing going on except that which is in consciousness. Also, we demonstrate it every night, that consciousness is perfectly capable of creating a universe. Because we dream. And in our dreams, we have, we're in a situation, like we could be dreaming that we're in a room. And there are people in the room, and they're talking. And maybe you're sitting at a table having coffee with somebody and you're talking. And you can knock on the table, and it's hard, it's real. You can pick it up and feel the weight. It may be too heavy for you to lift, so there's proof that it's real. So in our dreams, we create a world that is just as real to us in the dream as this world is to us here tonight. The dream is in a space. Let's say you're sitting at a coffee table, having coffee, and that's in a room. So this room was created in the dream. And you may sit there and talk with the person for an hour, have coffee with the person for an hour. And yet, if somebody had a encephalograph on your brain and were measuring your brain waves, you would discover that the whole dream took a second or two. So that hour of time, elapsed time in your dream happened in a second or two. That space in which the dream took place, what happened inside your brain, I guess, is what you have to think if you're into a 3D interpretation of this. So What I'm saying is that you created time and space, and the person you're talking to, you created them, and you wrote their lines. It's your dream. You wrote their lines. You wrote your lines. You wrote the lines of the waitress that brought you the coffee. You wrote the part where you decided what kind of croissants that they had or sweet rolls that they had that you could have with your coffee. You wrote all of that. And then you wake up. What happened to that hour? Well, it was only a second. What happened to that room? Well, it never was.
So then why do we dream?
Hmm?
Why do we dream?
Why does who dream? If there were a you, I would tell you that you probably dream in order that you can see that there doesn't need to be a you for all this to happen. It's a hell of a good demonstration that everything I'm saying is possible. I mean, you demonstrate on a nightly basis that you can create these huge fantasies and you can populate it with people. I mean, your friends, your really close friends may be in your dream, but no, they were in their beds. They weren't in your dream. But you were relating to your really close friends in your dream. You know, you had experiences with them. You can learn from your experiences. You can wake up the next morning and have gained something from the dream. You may have gotten some insight in your dream. Who knows? You know, I mean, all this happens in your dream. Your mind is capable of creating the whole thing. I lost the point. Oh, there's one more point. Also be aware, so you're in that dream, you know, the dream starts and your dream starts and you're sitting at the coffee table in mid-conversation, okay? And your friend says, well, what did you do last night? And you tell him what you did last night. Well, the dream just started now. There was no last night. The dream just started now. But in the dream, there was a last night. In fact, there was apparently an entire history. I mean, you know, your dream didn't start with Adam and Eve. Your dream starts right in the middle. And yet, to you sitting in your dream, you don't feel like it started right now. You feel like you've been sitting there and you could, if you were asked, tell how you got there and all that. So even the idea of previous time is seamlessly created in your dream so that it makes sense to you. You see what I'm saying? So right now, as we sit here, we don't know whether this dream started with Adam and Eve or 2 seconds ago, and the Adam and Eve story and all the other stuff that led up to this point was created as part of the dream. There's no way of telling.
Is that why, as you do this work and start to distance yourself from that personal I, you don't relate so much like to your own past? Like I started having this experience of seeing pictures of myself as a little kid and not
And it's not you. It has nothing to do with you. I don't know if that's the reason or just, you know, I mean, as you believe in yourself less and less, that it has less reality to you. Remember always that the one who's believing less and less is that one. It's the same one, of course. The one who doesn't believe in the past so much is the same one. So there's no reason to believe the lie of solidity, clearly demonstrated by modern science that it's not solid, that it's all vacuum. For all practical purposes, there's no reason to believe in the reality of this meeting tonight. We all have demonstrated thousands of times our ability to create such a scenario. We're able to create scenarios where people that talk to us say things we don't know. That happens in our dreams. We're able to get married and raise children in our dreams. Robert tells the story of the man who lost his children and went to their funeral through a calamity, and he went to their funeral and was not, you know, torn up with all sorts of tears and did not show a great deal of uncontrollable grief or anything like that, and everybody really thought he was being a hard ass. And they said, why is that? And he said, well, last night, he said, I dreamed that I was in, you know, some country, and I married this wonderful woman, and she turned out to be my queen, and I turned out to be the king, and we had, you know, 5 children, 3 princes and 2 princesses, and we raised them, and we were out hunting tigers, you know, when my kids were 14, 15, and 16, and this tiger jumped out of the tree and came down and killed my sons, and by the time I got home, you know, there's some calamity had hit his wife and his kids, and he said, and then I woke up, and he said, so now I don't know whether to mourn for my children in the kingdom or my children here. And he was a wise enough man to know that both are dreams, and that if he woke up, he would discover that he was the consciousness in which this dream was happening. And part of this dream was that he was the consciousness within the dream in which that other dream happened. No way to prove it's not so. That's what I used to do years ago when I first got messed up when I was a young kid. It occurred to me that I couldn't prove that there's anything out there. That was my first real brain teaser for me, as it became obvious to me that there was no way that I was ever going to be able to prove that there's anything out there. And my reasoning was that the only way I know something's out there is that it comes to me through my senses. So like, I see this cup here. Well, the story is that the light bounces off this cup and it strikes my eye, okay? And it gets focused on the retina, and photons hit some little pot in the retina, and it gets converted into some sort of a electrical impulse that can travel along a neural cord, okay? So now I don't have light coming off a cup anymore. What I've got is a neural impulse, and presumably different frequencies of the light is what produces the color, but presumably that results in, I guess, different frequency of neural impulses or something. But the fact is that there's neural impulses that are going up my optic nerve, and they go to my brain. And now here's this meatball with little channels in it, and it's got electrical impulses that are running around in it, okay? And that's its only source of input. Now, it never sees anything. All it gets is electrical impulses. So it's got electrical impulses running around in it. And it's got another set of electrical impulses running around from the stuff that comes in through the ears, and another set of electrical impulses running around for the stuff that comes in through the fingers, and another set for the stuff that comes in through the nose, and another set for the stuff that comes in through the tongue, and another set for the stuff that's running around in there because I'm thinking. But all it is a bunch of electrical impulses running around inside a meatball, okay? And yet the meatball, out of these electrical impulses, creates this picture of people and cups and all this stuff, you know. It creates this stuff out of electrical impulses. Is that the story you're telling me, that the meatball is creating all this imagery out of the electrical impulses running around inside of it? Well, if it can do this, it certainly didn't need the electrical impulses, did it? I mean, it made it up out of nothing. Why does it decide that the electrical impulses of this frequency are orange and see orange? Right? You know, it's just such nonsense that it could create this imagery and these sounds and everything out of these little electrical impulses running around inside of it. The fact is that it's all happening inside a consciousness, and the meatball's inside a consciousness, and the electrical impulses and all that's just nonsense. The fact is that my consciousness is not inside that meatball. That meatball is inside my consciousness. And I claim that if the brain can recreate this picture out of those electrical impulses, it didn't need the electrical impulses. It must have had a previous idea of what this stuff looked like, and where did that come from?
So what does that mean when you say it's all happening inside of consciousness, as opposed to, what was the opposite part?
There is no alternative to consciousness. All there is consciousness. Everything's happening in consciousness.
So what does that mean?
We used to think, what people claim is that consciousness is, the human 3D story is that your consciousness is inside your brain. That the seat of consciousness is inside the brain, and that all this stuff is a matter of electrons running around inside the meatball. And I'm saying nonsense. The meatball is inside the consciousness. One of the things my brain is aware of is my brain. Whoops. Now I've got something inside and something outside, and it's the same thing. My brain is in my consciousness, and my consciousness is in my brain. Whoops.
Sounds like a non-fun situation.
Yeah. So let's see, that's probably plenty of confusion. So I can tell you now that Robert's experience is that he always knows that he's the consciousness. And he said to me several times that he sees exactly what everybody else sees. But he sees it as consciousness rather than seeing it as separate realities. Okay? Well, it's like if I look at you and I think you're a 3D object, that's one thing. If I think I'm Lee a 3D object and I look at you, then I think you're a 3D object, okay, and we're in the 3D human world. If I'm aware of the fact that I'm consciousness and that this body here that we call Lee is an appearance in consciousness, then if I'm always aware of that, then I'm also always aware that that body I see over there is an appearance in consciousness. Okay? So now instead of seeing you, I see consciousness as you. And instead of seeing me, I see consciousness as me. Or as Joel would say, I see God as you, and I see God as me. I see God as everything. The mystical experience that people talk about, not just the people that use the word Maya, but that Joel talks about, and all the Christian mystics, everything. The mystical experience is recognizing that you are everything. Realizing that you're the trees, and you're the rocks, and you're the stream, and you're the butterflies, and you're the people, and everything. The mystical experience is realizing that you are everything. And that's in all the Christian literature, especially, they talk about that so ecstatically. And that's exactly saying that the mystical experience is recognizing that you're consciousness. And that everything is consciousness, and you're consciousness, and therefore you are the consciousness as everything. That is what the mystical experience is. And the Maya is the same experience without the recognition that you're the consciousness. Maya is that you're watching the movie and you bought it. The mystical experience is watching the movie but knowing you're the screen. Mm-hmm. Robert always knows that he is consciousness, and he was never confused that that body was him. He knew that that body sort of more or less was his in some sense, in some strange sense, but it was no more him than any other body that was around him, that was near him. So now we know where we're going. This is true for all of us. All of us are sitting here sucked into thinking we're this body. And all of us are the one consciousness expressed as all of us. There aren't any of us here. What's here is the one consciousness expressing as all of us. And the chairs we're sitting in, or the cushions we're sitting on, or the water we're listening to.
So then to be able to stay in that state where you're aware that everything is consciousness, the only way to get there is meditation. Is that how you get there?
that's a way that reliably brings you closer to it. Some people have a one-time experience like Robert had. Robert did not meditate. Robert was 14 when he had his experience, and before he was 14 he did not meditate. And after he was 14 he did not meditate. Before he was 14 he was not even consciously on a mystical path, and then he had the experience in which, as he puts it, he dissolved into the universe and became consciousness. And that experience never stopped for him, so from that moment on he was always there, in which case there was no Robert to meditate. But for those of us who think we're mortal, who think we're mere mortals, meditation is and classes like this, I mean, the purpose of this is to give a sense of direction, and meditation is a way of trying to quiet our mind enough to have the experience. The goal is to have the experience, and to have it completely enough that the ego center completely dissolves. If your mind is quiet, then you are having the experience. But our minds are never quiet. Our minds just chatter on thought after thought after thought after thought, and it's that endless. It's not the five senses that convince us that we're real. It's that sixth sense, the mind, with the endless stream of thought after thought after thought after thought, all about I and my this and my that, and I need this and I need that, and I hope he doesn't do that to me, and all this sort of stuff. That constant, the illusion of I is the result of thinking continuously about I. When you're asleep, there's no I. There's no you.
How do you get out of something like that? Because, I look at my 6-year-old and 5-year-old, and everything's about him, and my 2-year-old, everything's about him. Because, my 2-year-old hasn't really been conditioned yet to think that everything's about him. It's just like you're born that way.
Well, this lifetime he hasn't been conditioned about that, perhaps. But, in fact, when he was born, he was a lot closer to being realized than he is now, or than you are now, after being conditioned. So you have a new little baby, okay? And the baby is in your arms, such like, and the first thing you start doing is showing him, this is your nose, and these are your toes, and this is your hand, and you're teaching him, this is you, and this isn't. Okay, this is your nose, this is my nose, That's already you're conditioning him into the human belief in his own body as distinct from somebody else's body.
So if Robert had this little baby, what would Robert be saying to him?
He has 2 very unenlightened daughters.
Some of us are meant to be on a spiritual path, and some of us aren't.
No, you can't not do that. You can't not. The kid took on a body. The reason the kid took on a body is because it's not enlightened yet, and so it needs to be. You can tell it whatever it can hear.
That's not your nose.
Robert also says the conditioning's been happening for lifetime.
Yeah, lifetime.
Not just in this lifetime as it's perceived right now, that it's been conditioning over as long as we know.
And
so we're all conditioned to be unconditioned.
and there's only one consciousness, and there's 8 million people thinking in it. So even if you keep your mouth shut, the other 7,999,000, 7,999,000,000, etc., people are going to condition him for you. But you can tell them the truth. The flip side of it is that right now I'm talking about the truth to people that are stupid enough to come here and hear it. to people who...
Desperate enough.
To people,
well, you just lost my business.
Yeah. to people who are ready to hear it, to those who are drawn here to hear it, this is a step on the path. People are drawn to Robert, people are drawn to come here. And it's all deconditioning. dehypnosis. Rajneesh used to talk about dehypnotization as what it was all about. Getting rid of, and that he's using hypnosis there in the same sense that Joel used, getting rid of the hypnotism. Dehypnotizing is what it's all about. And we do that by hearing the truth and by immersing ourselves in the consciousness of people who know the truth rather than in the consciousness of people who reinforce the conditioning.
When Robert talks about the silence, he talks a lot about being in the silence, that, so he would be always in the silence, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no I.
Right.
Okay, so if we got enlightened along those lines, our thinking would stop all that.
There would be no you. I mean,
Yeah.
Li and enlightenment are mutually exclusive. Okay? As long as there's a Li, there's not enlightenment. Now, sometimes there are moments of not self. Sometimes we have moments in which we don't have ourself, but then we come back because it wasn't a complete enlightenment. Lots of us have that kind of experience. Robert just had the one experience. He went out and never came back. But usually it's increment by increment, appears to be increment by increment. The fact is, the whole thing is really ludicrous because it's already done. I mean, the fact is that all of us are just the one consciousness. There is nobody here. I mean, the fact that we're even talking about it is just part of the Maya. The class is part of the Maya. The idea that we need to go to a class to gain understanding so we can get out of the Maya is part of the Maya. When we're unconscious, there is no self, and there is no Maya, like when we're deep sleep. When we're dreaming, they always talk about the three states of consciousness. When we're in deep sleep, then there's no consciousness at all that we're aware of. And Robert would say that in that sense, you're enlightened, but you're not aware of it, which is absolutely useless, of course. But, no time passes during those periods, like nothing's happening. There's dreams, and during that we're in a different reality than this one. But it's as real as this one. And again, we think we're someone in our dream, and again, there's chatter going through that one's head. It's just a different chatter, perhaps, or it might be the same chatter. We might think that I'm in this dream as this person or whatever. And there's waking, where we're listening to this endless stream of chatter. The monkeys chattering in the trees is how they refer to it in the East. I just love that. They talk about this thing between your temples as the monkeys chattering in the trees. That's sort of a poetic way of talking about the committee. When you first wake up in the morning, before your first thought, you're enlightened. In that gap, that's it. That's the experience. In that pause where you're conscious before the first thought. Now, of course, if you wake up to an alarm clock, you're going to wake up with a thought. As you go for turning it off. But if you just wake up naturally, and if you pay attention, which you have to have gone to sleep planning to pay attention, if when you first wake up, if you wake up paying attention, if you wake up being aware of what's happening in the moment, then there's an experience there that you can have before the first thought. And of course you wake up and you have that experience and you say, is this it? And that's the sentence. Oh well. Now the game is to lengthen the periods between thoughts. And they do stop. I mean, thoughts do separate. The other analogy they always give is like a sky that's covered with clouds. And then as the day goes on, the clouds thin, and then periodically there's little patches of blue showing through, and then the clouds get smaller and the patches of blue get bigger, and that's more the way minds seem to work. But you, as a result of meditation, your mind will start having gaps, and you start seeing those gaps. And the reason I tell you that I know about that space in the morning is because when I sit in the silence now, it's exactly the same as that space in the morning before the first thought. You can develop that ability to be in the silence. Silence doesn't mean no sound. Silence means no li. When I'm sitting in the silence, I'm sitting in the no li, and you can learn to be there. And that's where you have the experience that what I'm talking about is true. Is when you're in the silence. That's when you have the experience that will tell you that will allow you to see that this is true. That you have your own experience of it. Otherwise, it's just hearsay and conjecture. Meditation is the way that the purpose of all valid forms of meditation is to, and all other spiritual practice, is to help you develop the ability to be in the silence. And there are hundreds of different ways of doing that, but that's the whole purpose of spiritual practice, is to learn to develop the ability to be in the silence.
I think people look at silence and meditation as the same thing.
Well, meditation gets confusing because we use the word meditation for the practice and we use the word meditation for the result. So I use the word meditation. I used to use the word meditation to refer to sitting in the silence, but I don't do that anymore because it confuses people. So I now talk about meditation as the practice and sitting as in the silence, or being in the silence, as what I used to call meditation. It's what Joel calls communion. Joel uses the word meditation for essentially what we call praying or practicing, doing something, trying to, doing those things which we think will increase the chances of our being in the silence. And he calls the silence communion, or prayer. He calls that prayer, I guess, actually. But there are lots of practices that we can do to become silent. But good old AA, no spiritual practice is going to work until you've cleaned house. If you've got a bunch of crap going on in your life, you're not going to be in the silence because you're going to be worrying about the crap. Jesus says a great thing. He says if you're going to the altar to make your supplication or your prayer, and on your way there you remember that you have aught against somebody, he says, put down your gift and go clean up the thing with somebody else, and then come back and make your supplication. What he's saying is if you got anything else going on in your life, there's no sense going to the altar because you ain't going to find God. So the reason the 11th step is 11th is because you got to done the other 9 and be regularly doing the 10th in order to have any prayer of being quiet enough to do the 11th. I mean, you can pray anytime, but to meditate, you need to have your house clean. It just so sounds spiritual, And Al-Anon and all the other 12-step programs that are based on that. The 11th step should be 11th. And the 12th step should be 12th, by the way. After you've achieved the silence, then you have something to share.
About nothing.
About nothing. And no one.
If you've got nothing, that's worth sharing.
Lee, my experience with the silence, when you say silence, I think some people think of an audio thing. My experience with silence it's been so overwhelming. It's more of a stillness. Mm-hmm. It's a nothingness. It's not something that you hear in your ear.
Right.
There is absolute nothing.
That's why I say the silence is the lack of self, not the lack of audio. the sound. In the Buddhist they talk about the void. The trouble is that any word is wrong because it's not a void. You can recognize a void. Void is something you can recognize. It's like if you had a blackboard, you can't write on it in black chalk, right? Nobody will see it. In order to recognize something, it's got to be a different color from the background, okay? Well, what we're talking about is the background against which we can recognize silence, against which we can recognize void, against which we can recognize space, against which we can recognize nothing. We can look and say, wow, there's nothing here, Now, what's the background against which we can see the nothing? It's that I'm talking about. And if you've got a word for it, that ain't it. Because if you've got a word for it, that's a concept. If you've got a concept, it's in your consciousness. And this is outside of that. This is there's so many words, the Godhead, they call it the womb of creation. This is that beyond everything is what it is. And of course, the other thing that's confusing is that when we have an experience of it, we're having the experience through our 3D human body. So it gets translated back into human terms, somehow. So, but yeah, that's why I said it's not the lack of noise, it's the lack of self is what I'm talking about. The self I'm talking about is consciousness, not Li. It's not just the lack of Li, it's also the lack of everything. Is the silence. No, nothing.
How does that relate to when you say happiness is the default? How does that relate to the void or the lack of self?
At two different levels. First of all, at a much more pedantic level, happiness is in the default in that if you just don't worry and don't think about things, you'll be happy. Okay, in a very human sense, happy as compared to unhappy. At the much higher level, when you're in the experience of the silence itself, the feeling that translates back into the body is blissful, which is even a step beyond happiness as the default. Really, bliss is the default. Really, you are bliss.
So there's a feeling that's associated with that.
It starts out with happy just by not creating misery. By not creating misery, by not creating anything, you are happy. Okay, there's just nothing wrong unless you think something's wrong. The next step is joy. The next step is bliss. But again,
for me, it's been. I'm at a state where the effect is an improved humanhood. If that's any form of a measurement, it's like,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's like those things that used to plague me no longer plague me. And I experience moments of joy, but it's not continual,
Sure.
So it's almost like, I don't know, that it's like the measurement to me is right now to improve humanhood.
It will always appear that way until the humanhood disappears. Yeah, as you grow, the rule is that your experience is the outpicturing of your own state of consciousness. As your state of consciousness gets higher, so does the experience. That's necessarily true. Mm-hmm. And certainly, it used to be for us alcoholics, if you were like me, when I came in, I always wanted to drink. I always wanted a drink. And then it got to where there were periods where I didn't want to drink. And the periods where I did want to drink weren't as intense. And it sort of, backed off until there were gaps, And by just doing the steps and hanging out in the consciousness of people that didn't need to drink. Okay? And from there, then I was very happy to not want to not be obsessed with drinking. Okay? then, 2 years later, the requirement for happiness was I had to not worry about jobs. My humanhood improved. I didn't need to drink. My life was now starting to happen. My head was just as active as it could possibly be, and it's now worried about careers and jobs and girlfriends and yada, yada, yada. So now happiness was not having to worry about something, okay? So the default was if I could stop worrying about my job and all this stuff, then I would be happy. So you do a lot of happiness. Then, as you get quieter, you start feeling joy. Now, joy is different from happiness because joy doesn't have a reason. I'm happy because I got a new car. I'm joyful because, and I remember the first time I felt joy, I was out on my motorcycle and I was riding up the hill out into the valley, and it was a gorgeous sunny day, and it was before we had to wear helmets, so my head was not in a bucket. And it was just gorgeous, and this feeling started way down here below the solar plexus, like bubbles coming up, and this tingling, and it was filling me up, and like champagne was down there or something, just this tingling feeling, and it was just joy bubbling out of me, for no reason except that it was just goddamn neat, And that was my first feeling of joy. And then joy started happening more frequently, and that was one joy in 40 years, or 36 or 7 at the time, Then joy started happening more frequently. Now sometimes I'm in the silence, and now I'm in the silence longer and longer and more, and that too is progressing. It's a progression, but every phase along that, my humanhood was significantly better. I tell people, I'm 25 years sober, and I guarantee that every year of my sobriety has been significantly better than the preceding year. And by that I mean that there's more love and more joy and more. Now I can add more bliss by a significant and measurable amount than there was the preceding year. Now Robert had the experience that he got thrown into the permanent, perpetual state of bliss.
And the bliss is being in the consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the bliss is.
Not being in the consciousness, being the consciousness. Mm-hmm. Yes, but yes, that's it.
That's it.
The bliss is the silence is the.
That's right.
And that's the real default. If you could just stop believing in the lie of Lee, then the default's. So really I lie when I say it's happiness. The default's really bliss.
Right, because Robert also talks about the duality. As long as you live, in the humanhood, as long as you're in the mind and body phenomenon, there's going to be that duality
Mm-hmm.
of happiness and then not being happy,
Sure.
and then,
Exactly.
so that's
Everything I have I can lose.
That's right.
Everything I don't have I can get and then lose. Birth is the first step of dying, from the duality viewpoint. Robert's teaching is called Advaita Vedanta. And Advaita means non-dual. It's not singular. It's not called one. It's just not two. Because even one has implication of, to say there's one, you've forced duality, because there's that which is not the one. So it's very carefully called not dual.
Does God play a part in any of Robert's teaching?
Well, what do you mean by God is the answer to that.
Yeah, that's usually what he says.
Question.
Somebody asks.
Well, but the question, if you mean,
Separate entity.
yeah, it depends on what you mean by God. Now, some people, if you listen to the Christian mystics talking about the Godhead, what they're really talking about is the void, the vacuum, the silence, okay? So if that's what you mean by God, then yes. If you mean the God that created the universe, then that's in mind. But not necessarily created by people. Yeah. if you believe in a God in a white cloud, then this is a God that's created by humanity, okay? The closer your God is to Sugar Daddy or Santa Claus, the more human he is, okay? Well, I mean, Santa Claus God, most gods are created in the image of the person who's worshiping them. But there are higher gods, like the God that created the universe, and the God who is the law, and the God who is all that, but even that's in mind. And then there's, so it depends on what you mean by God.
I have a question. In reading like some of the Joel books or whatever, I get a little confused because, there's mention of God, there's mention of Christ, there's mention of Master, and I just get
Okay. The Master is the word Joel uses to refer to Jesus. And he's very careful to call him the Master because he wants you to recognize that he thinks of Jesus as a master, like Buddha was a master, as distinct from the only begotten Son of God. Okay? Now, he uses the word Christ in the sense of Christ consciousness. And he says that that's exactly the same as what is meant by Buddhahood, or what is meant by the Tao. All these words are the same thing. He uses Jesus because his students were the Christian Science and Unity people and the metaphysical Christian churches. So it was a lot easier, in order for him to communicate with them, he could talk about Jesus and Jesus' teaching. But Joel was very clear that Jesus was an enlightened master, as was Buddha, as were Shankara, and Joel makes a list of several of them, that he is aware of. Joel, when he was in Europe, used to take a side trip to India, which is not mentioned in the Joel books, and he used to go to Ramana Ashram, which is where Robert went when he was enlightened. He went to spend some time with Ramana. Joel used to go see Ramana. And there's a thing called The Mountain Path, which is a newspaper that's published at the Ramana Ashram, and Joel used to write for it. So Joel was not, his name is Goldsmith, but he certainly was not Jewish, and he certainly was not strictly Christian, although he was probably the most Christian person you would ever meet. Much more so than the Pope, who was locked into their interpretations. Joel lived very, very closely to the ideal as expressed by Christ the Master. So that's what that's all about. And when he says God, he's talking about the experience in the silence. And he talks about Buddhahood or Christhood or that sort of thing as the human experience of that. The one who's wearing a body, who's having that experience. Joel knew what he was talking about. His teaching is very limited by his audience, of course, because, if you want to freak him out, he spent his time traveling around the world, raising them like children, teaching them. He'd go around and teach everybody the next truth, and then he'd go around a year later and teach them all the next level of truth, and he went from essentially 1950 to 1962 teaching higher and higher metaphysical truth, and in 1962 he finally started teaching a little bit of the mystical truth, because by now he'd been working with people for 10 or 15 years and they could hear him. So that's a lot about what's going on. But if you go back and read the Infinite Way itself, you'll find it's a very mystical, a lot of mystical truth is in that. Also in The Thunder of Silence, it has a great deal of mystical truth. Read chapter 6 in The Thunder of Silence. On the nature of mind, by the way. What else?
You were talking about the different gods. You said there was a god for the universe and a god for something else. What did you mean?
People have different different people have concepts of God at different levels, is what I was talking about.
But there's only one consciousness, there's not like 5, 10, 20.
There's only one consciousness, and there's all sorts of things. My answer to her question is, what do you mean by God? People use the word God at all different levels. All there is consciousness. There is no God. Or it's all God, whichever way you prefer. Barbara tells the story of going to Joel, saying, she finally got it, that there is no God in the sense of her concept of God, in the sense of a nice, handy concept of God. She finally went to Joel and she said, I got it. She says, I know what you mean. She says, there really is no God. And Joel nods. He nods and he says, but there is something. So, if you've got a concept of it, that's not God. Okay? But there is God. Okay? That's as good a name as any for it, whatever it is. For consciousness, for silence, for void. God's another perfectly good name. I mean, they're all wrong if you think you know what I'm saying, what the word means.
So when my 5-year-old asks me, what is God or who is God, what is the answer?
You tell him as much truth as he can hear. God is love, maybe is what he wants to hear. God is consciousness. It's probably something he won't understand. But, with children, you typically give them the most simplistic true statement that you can give them. And then if he wants more information, he'll immediately ask you the next question, and if that's enough, he won't. It's like if your 5-year-old asks you where do babies come from, he's not asking for the full sex lecture. Mommy, they come from mommy is probably a fine answer, and we don't need to go into all the details. Same thing with God. Tell him something that's consistent with your experience of God. God is a loving force, or whatever word for force a 5-year-old could hear. Or maybe just God is love. I would tell him a truth that feels to me to be consistent with where he's at, and that's in the right direction. Our experience, all of our concepts of God have been just fine for as high as we were. But then, the sugar daddy idea of God is a lot better than the devil idea of God. And, Santa Claus is a much better idea. At least we've got a loving God, and we've gotten away from the hateful God, the punishing God. We're into the loving God. It'll take care of us, and then we find out that we need to go a level higher because, sugar daddy God is a little impractical and doesn't really work, so we go a little higher, But the sugar daddy God is not wrong. It was just limited, okay? It was on the right track, and the next level of God is not wrong, but it's on the right track, but it's limiting, and what we're doing is throwing away the limits. The problem with God is that to characterize something limits it. As soon as I say anything about something, I've limited it. So you can't say anything about God or consciousness because the discussion is going on within it. So you'll just have to be it, which you can't avoid.
And so once you are in that self-realization that you are it, it's real difficult to be satisfied in this worldly reality.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like a joke.
Yeah. It's a very funny joke. But
It really is.
But it's not when you're believing it. Once you finally get, the joke is that there never was anybody that needed to become enlightened. The joke is that we spend lifetimes trying to grow spiritually, and that one who's trying to grow spiritually never was. That's the joke. Lots and lots of people have seen it, and it's always the same truth.
It's a joke about step 3 if there's nothing to surrender.
Mm-hmm. Well,
The
everything.
whole idea that you...
Well, the idea, I mean, I love, like all the words we use to describe God is omniscient, I mean, well, how can you not be conscious of anything that, I mean, if God is consciousness, then God clearly is conscious of everything that's in consciousness because God's the consciousness. So, I mean, what is this omniscience? It's impossible not to be, and omnipotent, there's no power to be used and nothing to use it on. Omnipresent, there's no where. How can he not be, I mean, God is everywhere? No, there's nowhere. God has all the power? No, there is no power. God knows everything? No, there's nothing to know, the whole thing just gets really ludicrous.
What is the definition of consciousness? When you start going through that whole circle?
Well, now we're in the bind, because if I tell you what consciousness is, that would be a concept within consciousness.
It's nothing. It's just nothing.
But even nothing, if it has any meaning. Maybe you can get to it. Awareness is another fine word for consciousness. And if you can be aware, rather than being aware of something, can you just be aware of the fact that you're aware? Can you be aware of awareness? I mean, you're aware that there is awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So you can be aware of awareness. That's pretty clean. That's pretty much just like consciousness. It's one step removed because it's being conscious of consciousness. But that's what I'm talking about is the awareness without being aware of anything. Like we always add one of the 5 senses or 6 senses into what we're aware of. And we're just talking about pure awareness, Robert would say.
What's the other 2 words that go with that? Pure awareness. Effortless. Effortless, choiceless, pure awareness.
Choiceless, effortless, pure awareness.
Say that again.
Well, Robert always talks about choiceless, effortless, pure awareness. But those words are extra too. Because choiceless sounds like there's somebody to make a choice, and effortless sounds like there's somebody to make an effort. Pure awareness is an equivalent for consciousness. Bliss is synonymous with consciousness. Love is synonymous with consciousness. God, in that sense, is synonymous with consciousness. But a pure awareness has as good a... He also used ultimate oneness. That's another one he likes to use, ultimate oneness. Which brings in the concept that there's nothing else. The trouble with oneness is that we immediately get into a space picture of it and want to know what's outside of it. Minds are fiendish things, aren't they?
But there's a purpose for them, otherwise we wouldn't have them.
We who?
I haven't gotten that far yet.
Fair enough. We who? It's all the movie. This is all the movie.
The whole purpose is to awake.
But everybody's already awake. Now we're back to the Leela, last week's talk. It's all the play. Just a play.
That was really helpful for me the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
I had a whole lot of fun with that.
Good.
It just lifted things right off of me, and
You know, and it helped because I do creative writing, and it really helped to see these characters, to really look at them without that personal thing.
I love it. I mean, I love the name Leela. I mean, I would have used Leela even if it didn't have Lee in it. You know, I happen to obviously like Leela because it has Lee and AA in it both, but
There's some good actors out there.
but it's they're all really good at their jobs.
I really looked at them because I was so busy getting hurt.
They're really good at their roles. Yeah.
You remove that, and it's like, whoa.
Boy, is she good at that. I have a friend who this is years ago, who had a 5-year-old daughter who was just as contrary as she could possibly be. She was not going to do what she was told. I mean, she just was. And he was telling me about one day he came home and he wanted to get her to do this, you know, and the screaming match going on, and she actually pulled down her pants and peed on the rug right there in front of him, you know. And I'm just roaring with laughter. I'm thinking, wow, she is really good at being her, you know. I mean, awesome. I mean, how could you do that better, you know? I mean, this little girl is so good. And I mean, I see the whole thing, and I know where he's at, you know, and it's just perfect for him. You know, it's a script event is what it was. She was reading the script, but it was just perfect, you know. And, I mean, you know, you got to look at that with Leela and love it. I mean, perfect.
I'm sorry I missed last time. Can you just quickly do the tape?
No, there's a tape. No, I can't just quickly. That would not do it. But she was, you know, I mean, you see people like that, you know, they're all just so very good at being themselves. And if you look at it that way, it's such a kick. So this is sort of the third one in this series of 3 talks. I don't know what we'll talk about next. The next talk is on January 8th, I think. Yeah, 2 weeks from tonight is Christmas, so we probably won't hold one that week. And the next week is New Year's, and then the following Tuesday we'll have the next gathering. And feel free to drop me an email or call me or something if there's anything you'd like to talk about, because it makes no difference to me at all. I mean, all we're talking about is consciousness. All we're doing is getting together just to be in the silence and share the consciousness. So it doesn't matter what we talk about, so feel free to guide. I felt led to talk about Leela and Maya and the heaviest burden just because it's good to see that stuff. If you see that stuff, you know, to the extent that you see that, your humanhood will improve. To the extent that you see that, you will be easier on it. It'll lighten the burden. If you can approach letting things be the way they are and seeing them for what they are. So we'll do it again on the 8th. So let's be quiet. Thanks for coming.